I heard this story from a senior at university when we went out drinking one time. When he was just a baby, his parents got divorced and his mother raised him alone. They had no money, so she couldn't take him to kindergarten, meaning that she often left him at home alone. One day, she left work early, but when she got home, she heard him talking to someone. Surprised, she looked at him and saw him talking to the air and nodding as though listening to someone else. Apparently, he himself didn't really remember this, but he did realize from a young age that something like a black shadow was often nearby. This black shadow was his friend, and often acted like his parent. When he was alone, it would speak gently to him, and play with him as well. When he was young, he apparently thought of the black shadow as his father. Of course, his real father was somewhere else. Finding this all a little suspicious, his mother started watching him around the clock, and so the black shadow disappeared. But even now, he says he can still sense it nearby sometimes. Apparently, it hides under the bed or behind doors, and it smiles somewhat sadly at him. Hey guys, I'm your host, Tara A. Devlin, and welcome to this week's episode of Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. The latest volume of Kowabana, volume 16, is now available. If you want even more creepy tales of ghosts, haunted buildings, curses, mysterious rituals, and much more, make sure to check it out right now. And if you're looking for more to listen to, you can also find the audiobook for Sumikowa, The Haunting of Higanbana Heights, either on our Patreon, Fourth Wall Store, or various audiobook outlets, including Spotify and Audible, so don't miss out on that either if you're still looking for more. This week, we're looking at some stories of horrifying haunted homes. First up, a young man spends most of his life constantly moving around, because his mother claims that something is following them. But after she dies and he settles down with his own family, things seem to be going fine. Until one day, something reminds him of his mother's fears. Fears that may have been very real. But why? Find out what's happening in The Black Thing is Coming. I always live with my mother, just the two of us. According to her, my father disappeared shortly after I was born. I've never met my grandparents or any other relatives. That was just the way things were, I thought. It wasn't until much later in life that I realized that our situation was rather unusual. I don't remember when it was exactly, but I have memories of an older sister. Those memories are like a faint dream, so I don't know whether they're real or not. However, when I spoke about this to my mother as a child, for some reason, she got really angry at me. Around that time, we moved around a lot. I don't think we ever stayed in the same spot for more than a year. When I asked my mother about it, she just said, "Because we're being chased." "Chased by what?" I asked. "Something terrifying," she replied. "No matter where we go, it will follow us. That black thing will find us first." Even the way we moved was strange too. When I woke up in the morning, suddenly my mother had all our stuff packed and was ready to go. We basically didn't have any furniture, so she was able to pack quickly. Then we'd leave the house without even saying goodbye to the neighbors. It was always rushed, like we were fleeing something there. Everywhere we went, my mother met with so-called spirit mediums. They would chant something, give us various instructions, and order us to follow them. But I guess they didn't work, because we continued moving around constantly. One particular medium then ended by saying, "I cannot exorcise the thing haunting you. Perhaps nobody can." Around the time I was in the 4th grade, my mother and I ended up in a temple. This was because the chief priest had a reputation amongst the locals for being able to exorcise evil spirits. And so, we started living in a small solitary building in the corner of the temple grounds. Early each morning, we took part in seated meditation. I also had to learn Buddhist sutras. Sometimes we would douse ourselves in cold water, and other times bathe in ritual smoke. The chief priest chanted for us almost every single day, repeating the purification ritual over and over. Perhaps this reassured my mother, and for a while we remained at the temple without moving. When I started junior high, I had finally gotten used to living in the one place. I made some friends at school, studied like everyone else, and even joined a school club. As such, I soon found it unpleasant to keep living at the temple. When I complained about this to my mother, she absolutely lost it. Younger me would have been startled by this anger and just did what she said. But perhaps because I was entering my rebellious phase, this time I fought back. My mother was just possessed by delusions. Ghosts didn't exist, and so what we were doing here was meaningless. The chief priest of this temple was just using us as pawns to advertise his psychic powers. That was pretty much how I felt at the time. Many of the large variety of opinions and information I got from school and society at large helped reinforce those ideas. The rebellious feelings that had taken root in me towards spiritual matters continued to grow day by day. One night, during the winter of my final year at high school, my mother's voice woke me up. Moving out into the hall, the chief priest and one of the live-in monks were peering into her room. She was half crazed and crying about something. "The black thing is here! We're too late! I thought we'd be okay! We have to get moving again!" She was ranting like a deranged madman. "Oh, here we go again," I thought. "That's enough already!" I screamed at her. The chief priest turned to me with a terrifying look in his eyes, but he didn't say anything. Fed up, I returned to my room and went back to bed. The next day, I found a fire altar set up in the garden in front of the building we lived in. To my surprise, my mother was dressed all in white, and she was intensely chanting sutras with the chief priest next to it. Sometimes she would douse herself with water, and then she would return to the altar. On and on this continued. At first I was dumbfounded by the sight before me, but before long it struck me as utterly ridiculous, so I returned to my room. However, I could still hear their voices outside, and I was so completely and utterly fed up with all of it that I left the temple and went to stay at a friend's house instead. When I returned to the temple the next morning, I was shocked to see my mother was still carrying on by the altar. I tried to stop her, but the chief priest and another monk stopped me. Then they had the gall to ask me where I went the day before. Stunned, I ignored the priest as he kept asking me questions on the way back to my room. And then I went straight to school. This continued for the next 3 days, but then my mother collapsed with exhaustion and had to rest in her own room. The next day, she was found dead in her room. She had strangled herself. I was filled with grief, but also terrible anger. This temple had pushed her to her own death. My mother, an ordinary person, had undergone ascetic practices for 3 days straight, exhausting both her mind and body, and driving her insane to the point where she took her own life. Of this, I was absolutely certain at the time. Once her funeral was over, I grabbed the chief priest, criticized him for how he treated my mother, let him know exactly how I felt about our life at the temple, and then I stormed out of there. Having dropped out of high school, I then moved from place to place, working odd jobs here and there. After getting my heavy vehicle license, I then got a job driving trucks, but I never stayed in the one spot for too long. Maybe all that moving around as a kid had a lasting effect on me. But then, even for a guy like me, a turning point arrived. I got on well with a woman at work, and while we were dating, she got pregnant. We were already living together and things were going well for me, so I already had some decent savings too. As such, we decided to get married right away. Her parents were a little worried because I had no family to speak of, but being that she was already pregnant and our life together was already rather stable, the marriage arrangements went ahead smoothly. Before long, our child was born, and I felt like I had truly settled down in this area. I was a long-distance truck driver, so I was often away from home, but spending time with my wife and child on my days off let me experience a warm family life I'd never had before. But then one night, I suddenly woke up. A bad feeling washed over me, and I couldn't get back to sleep. My wife and 2-year-old were sleeping next to me. As I looked at them, it felt like someone was looking at me, so I turned to look at the corner of the ceiling. There was a dark shadow there. The room was dimly lit with a miniature bulb, but it was like the light couldn't reach that one corner, so it was pitch black. Squinting my eyes to see better, it appeared something was squirming there. Suddenly, I remembered what my mother once said. "That black thing will find us first. The black thing is here." I tried to shake off these foolish thoughts, but I couldn't. Unable to sleep, I continued to stare at it while I waited for morning to arrive. And as it got brighter outside, the shadow gradually faded. I went to work feeling sleep-deprived. The following night, the shadow appeared again. Once again, I could sense something looking at me from that direction. I was unable to sleep again. I didn't have work the next day, so I went to the hospital. "It's no doubt a hallucination caused by stress," the doctor said. "Why don't you take some time off work?" "I can't do that," I said. So he gave me some medicine. Even though I took said medicine, that night I woke up again. When I looked at the corner of the room, that black shadow was looking at me again. Maybe I was just imagining things, but it looked bigger than the previous day as well. Suddenly, I felt something behind me, so I turned around. A warrior in full armor was standing in the living room. He wore a mask, so I couldn't see his face, but I could sense he was looking at me. I only just barely managed to not scream. "It's just a hallucination, I told myself, and then I turned to look at my wife and child. An old woman in a white kimono was sitting on my wife's bed, glaring at me. I passed out. These hallucinations got worse day by day. It wasn't just the warrior and the old woman. I even started seeing a small child and an animal like a dog. "They're just hallucinations," the doctor said when I told him. "For now, you should take some time off work. It's possible that your old memories of your mother and the temple are creating the images of these stereotypical ghosts." When he put it like that, it did seem possible. I got some more medicine and then left the hospital. As I rode back home, I thought about taking some time off work, As I waited by some lights by the main road near my house, I spotted my wife coming towards me from the opposite direction, with our child on the front of the bike. When she saw me, she smiled and waved. Then our child did too. Continuing at the same speed, they rode onto the crossing. The lights were still red. Right in front of my eyes, a truck drove headfirst into my wife and child. I don't really remember what happened after that. People from the hospital, the police, my wife's family, they all appeared in front of me, but I don't really remember anything we may or may not have said. Next thing I knew, it was night, and I was at home laying out our 3 beds. I lay down in mine, then turned to stare at where my wife and child should have been. Strangely, I didn't cry. Looking at the ceiling, that shadow was there. But I didn't really care. If I turned around, that warrior and old woman would probably be there too. And if they are, I didn't really care, nor was I afraid. I turned to look at the empty beds again. That old woman was sitting on my wife's bed. For the first time, my emotions welled up. I was both pissed and absolutely devastated. Who the hell do you think you are to sit there? The only people who have the right to be here are my wife and child. The only people I want here are my family. My wife and child, my mother and father, even my sister who may or may not be alive anymore. Maybe I screamed. Maybe I threw things around. But when morning arrived, the room looked the same as it always did, with the 3 beds neatly laid out at my feet. More than 10 years have passed since then. I still work as a long-distance truck driver all over the country. I'll be turning 36 this year, and I'm still single and have no intentions of ever getting married again. I plan to keep on living like this until I die. I still don't really believe in the supernatural either. I'm convinced that what happened back then was just a product of coincidences and hallucinations. I don't believe in life after death or angry grudges, nor do I want to. If our consciousness, feelings, and memories all disappear when we die, then I can't imagine anything better. But if there really is life after death, and I were to become a ghost, then I'd like to find the ghost who stole my family from me and beat them to death again. The kid in this next story has a strange encounter with a girl in the neighbouring apartment. They're bored, so why shouldn't they play outside together? But what's really going on here? Find out in Strange Child. This is a rather frightening story from my childhood. That being said, my memories of it are quite vague. I believe it was evening and I was at home alone. I watched TV for a while, but then I found myself getting bored, so I opened the window and looked outside for a bit. Suddenly, the window in the neighbouring apartment also opened, and a girl stuck half her body out and turned to look at me. She looked to be 2 or 3 years older than me, but I didn't know who she was. She tried talking to me, but I don't remember what it was about. At some point, she then said, "Let's play outside." "The door won't open," I replied. "Then just jump out the window," she said. With a smile, she nimbly climbed onto the window frame, then dropped softly to the grass below. "Hurry up," she said, waving at me. Looks easy, I thought, and I moved to jump out the window as well. But then I heard a scream behind me, and next thing I knew, I was pulled onto my back on the tatami. My mother stood above me, a fearsome look on her face. I was so scared I might have wet myself. We lived on the 3rd floor. If I jumped from the window, I don't think it would have just been a light injury I suffered. As I got older, I got chills wondering what might have happened if my mother had been any later getting home that day. And apparently, there wasn't even a child in the neighbouring apartment. "But I saw her jump from the window. She was fine," I complained. So my mother personally went to check. An elderly couple lived next door and they said they had no knowledge of any small girl. My mother then called me a liar and I was banned from snacks for a week. Although that was thankfully lifted on the 3rd day. Maybe I was mistaken, or maybe I imagined it. But every time I saw news about a young kid falling from a window, I thought of that girl. If you have young children yourself, please be careful. Just in case, you should teach them that if someone asks you to jump out the window, you mustn't follow them. It might sound stupid, but you really never know. And finally this week, a young boy wants to move into the empty corner room of their house, but his mother is staunchly against it. He eventually gets his father to approve, but why was his mother so dead set against it to begin with? What lurks within this room? Find out in Empty Room. I live deep in the mountains in the country, but this story happened when I was a child. When kids are in the lower grades of elementary school, it's normal for them to still sleep with their parents, but when they get older, of course, they start to want their own room. "I want my own room like my older brother and sister," I begged my mother one day. At the time, we had an empty room in the corner of the 2nd floor. So I asked if I could have that one. The 2nd floor had 3 rooms, but other than that corner one, my brother and sister were using the others. However, my mother refused, yelling, "No!" so loudly that it surprised me. That room got great sunlight and was pretty much the best in the entire house. But for some reason, the storm shutters were always closed, and we used it as a storage room instead. Having said that, there wasn't exactly much in there, and we had a large storage shed in the yard, where we generally kept most things we didn't use. So in all honesty, this was a room we just didn't use. Even as a child, I found this strange, and it seemed absurd that I couldn't use it for myself, so I kept pestering my mother about it. Yet she was also unyielding and refused to budge. And so, with no other choice, I decided to change targets to my father instead. He was stubborn and strict, and someone I found scary as a child, so I didn't really want to ask him for anything. But that was just how much I wanted my own room. Looking back on it now, I didn't think it would be so hard to get that room, so I guess it made me even more stubborn about it. I asked him about it when he got back from the town hall, and, surprisingly, he readily agreed. I was ready for him to get angry at me, so my heart was pounding. But it was so anticlimactic that I stood there in a daze for a few moments. "What? Aren't you happy?" he said, and that finally brought me back to my senses. But my mother, who was listening behind us, suddenly went pale and came running over. "No! Absolutely not! Any room but that one! Do you not care what happens to you, Scare?" My mother was always so gentle, so I was surprised she was so dead set against it to begin with, but she never went against my father, so I was even more shocked. I was so shocked that I didn't even consider why she was so against me moving into that room. "Are you still going on about that?" my father said as he put out his cigarette. "That's the best room in the house, right? It's a waste to leave it sitting there like that. I listened to your opinion back then, but enough is enough. What sort of parent would stand in the way of their son's growth and independence?" Even as my father yelled at her, my mother still seemed more anxious than upset. Her strange behavior worried me, but I was so happy to get the room that I didn't pay any attention to it. The following weekend, my father and siblings helped move all the stuff out of that room on the second floor and clean it. The only furniture I had was a study desk, so I was soon moved in. My mother still looked upset, but my usual scary father did his best to be cheerful enough for the both of them. Seeing him sweaty and smiling at me was terribly reassuring. My first night sleeping alone, my mother almost seemed to sneak over so that the family wouldn't see her. She entered the room and then was about to say something, but I guess she thought better of it and closed her mouth again. Because she had been so against me moving in, I was still rather upset at her myself. "What?" I said strongly. At that, she jumped. "Sorry," she apologized. "This is your room now, so I won't say anything. But I want you to remember this one thing. If anything happens here, put your hands together and chant Namu Amida Butsu, okay?" Then she handed me a rather odd protective charm. I had no idea what was going on, and I didn't know how to answer her either. "Don't forget, okay?" she then said before leaving. The serious look in her eyes scared me more than what she actually said, and for a while I stared at the ceiling, before eventually I fell asleep. But nothing happened that night, and the next morning, my mother was back to her usual gentle self. A few more days passed, and I did my best to move furniture into my room from around the house that we didn't need, to make it look good. My mother also helped, so I soon forgot about everything that had happened. However, when a house on the outskirts of the village held a funeral, my mother started acting strangely again. I say strange, but all she did was sometimes look at me with worry in her eyes. The person who died was a woman my mother often chatted with, so I thought that might be the reason why and didn't think much more about it. But one night, a few days after the funeral, a strange noise woke me up. Our house faced a road leading into town on the other side of the mountains, so even at night, sometimes cars passed by coming from there. As such, I thought it might have been the sound of a car, so I looked at the window. It certainly seemed like a car was approaching as the curtain lit up, but then I noticed a shadow in the light. At first, I thought it was just a tree, so I ignored it. It's just a car, I thought, and tried to go back to sleep. But then a strange feeling washed over me. I must have stared at the window for 4 or 5 seconds. But usually when car headlights illuminate something, it's just for a second, right? So it shouldn't have been lit up the entire time I was staring at it. Perhaps a car had stopped outside, I thought. But there wasn't really anywhere to stop, and a car would have to stop in an odd position to be illuminating my window anyway. It was right on a bend on the road, and the other side was a sudden slope leading down to a swamp, so it was just a concrete wall with nothing but fields above it. What on earth would a car be doing stopping there? Did something unexpected suddenly occur? I was so worried that I was now wide awake. I got out of bed and looked at the window again, and it was still bright, like a car's headlights were shining on it. But looking closer, that didn't seem to be the real cause. The light was a strange pale blue. Nowadays you might think it was an LED light, but at the time such lights weren't around, and car lights were all pale yellow. And the shadow wasn't that of a tree either. For some reason, although the light was fixed, the shadow alone was getting closer. Sure, a shadow might sway in the wind, but there was no way it could move. And bit by bit, it started taking on the shape of a person. For the first time in my life, I felt fear. I was just a kid, but I still knew something terrible was happening. Panicking, I ran from my room. Then I ran straight to my parents. They were sleeping, but they woke up as I ran in. "What happened?" my mother asked, her voice full of worry. I almost told her what I'd just seen, but then I stopped. "Nothing. I just felt a little lonely sleeping by myself," I said. If I kicked up a fuss now after finally getting the room I wanted, then I thought they'd take it right back away from me. For a moment, my father looked surprised, but then he smiled. "At the end of the day, you're still a kid, huh?" he said, and let me into their bed. My mother didn't seem to believe me, and looked at me with worry in her eyes, but I ignored her and clung to my father as I went to sleep. Time passed normally after that, and while I was scared at first, nothing else happened, so I started to forget all about it. But then another person in the village died. This time, it was a man from nearby who often used to play with me when I was little. He was hospitalized with some illness, but apparently he never got better, and then passed away. One night, a few days after his funeral, it finally happened. A sound woke me up again, but this time I'd been playing in the mountains with a friend during the day, so I was slower to wake up. When I looked at the window, that shadow had taken on a much more distinct human shape compared to last time, and I could see it through the curtain. I tried to run again, but that shadow appeared to be right on the other side of the window. It looked like a person walking while ringing a bell, and because it looked like it was about to enter my room, I was too scared to move. I could also clearly hear the bell. Then it entered my room. As soon as it did, the light illuminating my curtain came with it, creating a rough tunnel of light in my room that enveloped me. Inside that tunnel, the man who had just died was ringing a bell. He looked at me, and I at him. "Hey, kiddo," he said. "It's been a while." But his eyes were vacant and lifeless, and his skin creepily pale, looking almost white in the light. So I just stared at him in fear. I was too terrified to say anything, and so I just stared. "What's with that frightened look on your face? You always used to greet me so happily. Did something happen?" he asked. I was almost scared to death, but he didn't seem like he wanted to hurt me, so I squeezed my voice out the best I could. "Hello," I managed to say. Looking back on it now, it was a stupid response, but that was the best I could manage at the time. "Hey, kiddo, have you seen my old lady?" I've been looking for her, but I can't find her anywhere." By old lady, he meant his wife. Of course he did, right? And I later heard that she went to stay with some relatives that night. Of course, there was no way for me to know that at the time, so I shook my head. "Ah, so you don't know then, huh?" he answered, his eyes unfocused, and then he seemed to ponder something for a moment before hitting upon an idea. His face lit up in a bright smile. He seemed to be genuinely happy, but to me, that smile looked absolutely terrifying. Fear seemed to paralyze my entire body. "Kiddo, let's go together." "Yeah, let's do that." He grinned as he approached me. My face was a mess of tears and snot, but there was nothing I could do. Until the old guy grabbed my arm, I was frozen. However, the moment he did, it was like all the cells in my body screamed, and a sharp jolt of electricity ran through me. Immediately, I shook his arm off, and then I crawled towards my desk. The old guy looked slightly surprised. "What's wrong, kiddo? I just said I was going to take you somewhere nice." He grinned as he approached me again. The gears in my head turned as I tried to figure a way out of this situation, but I was panicking too much to come up with anything. The only way to escape into the hall was to run past the old guy, but there was no way I could do that, and he was getting closer and closer. I thought I was done for, but then I remembered what my mother said. I put that protective charm she gave me in my desk drawer, so it should still be there. Immediately, I went to take it out, but then the old guy grabbed my shoulder. Another shock ran through my entire body, and I felt my consciousness begin to fade. But then I heard the sliding door to the hall open. There stood my mother, and she was holding a protective charm like the one she gave me that day. Angered, the old guy turned to her. "I will not let you take that child." My mother started chanting as she approached the both of us. The old guy took a step back away from me, as though he was scared of the charm. "The place you are going is over there. Go there by yourself," my mother screamed, and then she started chanting again. "You don't have to get that mad," the old guy said, sounding rather sad, and then he started down the hall where the tunnel continued. Just as he was about to disappear through the wall, someone in the hall screamed. It was my older brother and sister. My mother stopped chanting for just a moment, but then the old guy also stopped moving, so she immediately renewed her efforts. When the old guy fully disappeared through the wall and the tunnel of light also disappeared, only then did she finally stop chanting. Even though it was the middle of the night in winter, she was covered in so much sweat that steam rose from her body. What the hell was that? Someone just disappeared into the wall. My brother and sister screamed, running into my room. Suddenly, my mother stood up, embraced us, and started crying. I bawled as well, but my brother and sister just looked at us confused. Finally, my father also got up after hearing all the commotion. "I told you this room was dangerous. They tried to take Yusuke with them," my mother complained. My father stood there in silence, a troubled look on his face. "So you still don't believe me? Do you think I'm ill?" she continued. But my father's expression didn't change. "What do you think this is then?" she then said, removing my top and showing my arm and shoulder. It was then that I realized that I had a bruise in the shape of a hand where the old guy had grabbed me. "There's no way," my father said, falling to the ground. My brother and sister also looked on in fear. "If what you said is true, then..." Having said that, his face went blank, and my mother walked over to him. "How many times did I tell you? This room sits on a spirit path. We have to do something about it. It's dangerous." Neither I nor my siblings understood what she meant by spirit path, but my father nodded his head over and over. The next day, my father quickly got to work. He went straight to the village elder to discuss matters, asked him to introduce him to a Buddhist monk, and then he picked him up right away. The monk then instructed us to build a small temple in the front yard, but it was a little unusual. There was nothing in the space where the Buddhist statue usually sits, and there were slits in both walls that could fit talismans. There was also a door on the front and back side. It was kind of like an elevator, where you could come and go from either the front or the back. Then he laid stones with strange engravings on them in a path that led around the house, and had us build another small temple in the exact same manner in the backyard. "Now the spirits will move around your house. You have nothing more to fear," he said. And true to his word, nothing else happened again after that. When someone in the village passed away, everyone in my family slept in my room for a few nights to watch over me. Meaning it was somewhat like an experiment, but everyone other than my father hated it. However, they apparently spent quite a bit of money on building the small temples and paying the monk for his services, so my father insisted. "I need to be sure that it's working," he said, forcing everyone else to join him. Weird, right? But that's just like him. However, even after all that room ended up empty again. I didn't want to experience anything like that ever again, after all. My father had no choice but to knock down the storage shed. Then he built a small room for my brother out there away from the main house, while I moved into my brother's old room. And so, that room in the corner of the second floor turned into a storage room once again. My father complained about it constantly, but everyone else was in agreement, so he had no choice but to give in. Apparently, when my mother married him, they remodeled the house and that corner room was to be their bedroom. However, my mother has a strong sixth sense, so each time a spirit passed through, she was unable to sleep, and it started driving her mad. That was why they moved to a room downstairs instead. She apparently had a bruise exactly the same as the one I had too, and at first she thought that she perhaps did it to herself. But then, when she saw mine, and my brother and sister saw it as well, and finally, our father also accepted it. In the end, we built 2 temples for a storage room, and had to pay exorcism fees and buy new talismans annually as well. Once every 2 years, my father had to pick up that monk and drive him out to read sutras as well. Even now, I honestly feel kind of bad for him. Apparently, the spirit of that old guy was rather wicked because of his long stay at the hospital, which wore him down mentally. And because he was also so lonely, he wanted to take someone with him. Most spirits simply pass by, my mother said. However, those who died in accidents or self-inflicted deaths were quite frightening, she continued. They would attempt to take someone with them. It didn't matter who. And that's why that room remains empty even today, despite the fact my parents still live there, and my brother and his wife also live there. It's still a storage room, and the small temples are still outside as well. If you ever encounter a spirit path yourself, please get as far away from it as you can. It's said that spirits travelling on these paths are unable to leave them, so whatever happens, do not proceed in the same direction as that path. A huge thank you and shout out to this week's Kami tier members, Scarly and Emerald. It's thanks to your support, along with everyone else, that I'm able to keep doing this show, so thank you very much. Don't forget to check out Kowabana Volume 16, out right now, and check out our merchandise store at kowabana-shop.fourthwall.com. And if you'd like to chat about this week's stories, come and join us in the Kowabana Discord. You can find that link in the description or on kowabana.net. You can also check out our Patreon at patreon.com/TaraADevlin for exclusive bonus stories and extras, or our YouTube channel at youtube.com/KowabanaJapan for all sorts of Japanese horror you won't find anywhere else. Thanks guys, stay safe, and I'll see you again next time for even more Kowabana, true Japanese scary stories from around the internet. Want even more scary stories? Head over to kowabana.net for new translations every week. You can also join our Patreon for exclusive stories you won't find anywhere else. Head over to kowabana.net now.